Hey guys, it's Hank from Sprues and Brews, and today we're going to be checking out this brand new offering from Alpine Miniatures. This is their 135 scale US MG team in winter gear. It just became available on the Alpine website, and I was super stoked to get my hands on it. For folks who aren't familiar with the brand, Alpine Miniatures makes some cutting-edge resin figures in 135 and 116 scale. Most of their figures are World War II era, and they've got a whole range of US, German, Soviet, and even some Italian forces. Now, the timing of this release works out perfectly because we're right in the middle of the anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. Just before Christmas of 1944, German forces pushed through the Ardennes forest region of Belgium and Luxembourg in what would become their final major offensive of World War II. The Battle of the Bulge was some of the most brutal fighting that took place on the Western Front, and it's been covered in movies and TV shows for years, including probably most famously the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers. Anybody that's a fan of that fantastic series is immediately going to recognize these guys in their wool overcoats and their GI scarves. It takes you right back to those scenes of the men at Easy Company holding down the line in that brutal winter outside of Bastogne. So today I'm going to take you through how I painted these guys up. I practiced a whole bunch of new highlighting and shading techniques, and I'm going to show you all the stuff I learned. I'll leave links in the description below for all of the paints I'm going to use today, as well as a link to the Alpine Miniatures website if you want to pick up a set and try and paint them yourself. All right, with all that said, let's check it out. Okay guys, so here's a better view of the packaging for these figures. Alpine gives you a nice little pamphlet in the front there with images of all the different head assortments. As you'll see in a minute, each one of these figures comes with 2 separate choices for heads, which is a really nice feature. I've already painted up the ammo carrier figure, so one of these baggies is empty, but let's check out our 30 cal gunner. So at first glance, our torso, the majority of our torso, is one piece here. You can see the beautiful crisp molding. I love these figures. It's always a pleasure to paint them up. Here are our 2 head choices. So one of these has the netting on the helmet, the other one does not. I'm gonna go with the netting for this guy, I think. Here is our 30 cal with the hands attached. So those will fit nicely into place on his arms when he's assembled. We've got the right arm here, as well as his 45 sidearm and his canteen. So we're gonna have to snip those off of the little resin sprue here. Careful not to damage the actual piece. And the resin is really soft, so we can easily trim that down with our hobby knife. Before we start to work on the figure, it's really important to give all these pieces a little bath, just using some dish soap and warm water. There's a releasing chemical that they need to use on these resin figures to get them out of the mold, and we wanna get that off there before we prime the figure. If you've seen any of my previous figure painting videos, this little jig here is just a DIY painting jig. It's a drywall screw and a piece of wood, but it's a nice little platform we can mount our figures, our pieces on, so we can paint them separately without having to handle the actual piece. We're just gonna glue this guy together with a little super glue. There are some guide holes that Alpine puts into these figures, so you're gonna have a great fit, and you can just use whatever super glue you have lying around the house to assemble this guy. I recommend not attaching the head to the torso for the painting phase. It gives you a little more control when you're trying to work on the face later. So we're gonna grab some primer here. This is just Vallejo flat black acrylic primer, and we're gonna spray the head and the body. Now, almost everything we're gonna do today is gonna be with paintbrushes, but we're gonna just airbrush a little bit of Vallejo tan earth onto his jacket to start off. This is the biggest block of color, and it's gonna save us a little bit of time down the road. So we'll just block this in to start. All right, so with our jacket base coat down, we're gonna move on to some shadows here. We're gonna do our darkest shadows. So I'm gonna take that same tan earth that we used before and a little German camo brown, dark camo brown here. We're gonna do about a 50-50 ratio and mix that together. So using that dark brown we just made, we're gonna paint this into the deepest recesses of the folds in his jacket. It's gonna look a little stark in the beginning here, but stick with it. We're gonna blend these colors together, and it's gonna give us a nice natural shadow effect. Now, I don't consider myself to be much of a figure painter, but I really enjoyed doing it. I'm trying to step my game up. I did a lot of trial and error and experimentation here, so you guys get to come along for the ride. It's gonna be fun. With that darkest shadow down, we're gonna start to work back up to our main tan earth color. I'm mixing a 50-50 blend of our tan earth and a little brown beige. This should be a bit darker than our main color, but lighter than our previous mix. We're gonna brush this in next to all the areas where we painted our deepest shadow, trying to make a bit of a gradient effect working back up to our base color. You can see this is already making a big impact. The folds in the jacket have a strong artificial shadow that helps give the sculpt a lot of character at this scale, and the two-tone gradient helps us avoid any unnatural jumps from super light to super dark. Here I'm coming in with just our regular tan earth color. This is the same one we sprayed for our base coat, and I'm blending it into the edges of our shadows. I'm also overpainting any excess shadow that might have gotten onto the highest folds of our jacket. These are areas that we're going to highlight later, and shadows shouldn't naturally be there. For our first highlight color, I've made about a 3-to-1 mix of tan earth to khaki. This is going to lighten up our base color a bit, and we're going to start blocking this in on the raised folds of his jacket. It's a little tough to see, but this is going to help create a bit more depth to his jacket and help us build that full spectrum from shadow to highlight. Here I'm using our final highlight color. This is a 50-50 blend of tan earth to German camo beige, and we're going to apply this to the highest folds of his jacket, the tops of his shoulders, and his lapels. That's going to round out the highlights and shadow work on our jacket, and I think it's looking pretty good so far. Hopefully the wash that we're going to apply in a little bit is going to help blend everything together really nicely. Before that though, we've got to paint up the rest of our figure. So for our pants, we're blocking in some good old US olive drab. Moving on to his gear, we've got to do a bit of really delicate brushwork. This is always a good challenge. So we're going to start with some German camo beige and paint in his pack and the strap that goes to the pack. Now, you might be saying, why German camo beige? Well, we've got a lot of neutral tones here, and we need to make sure there are some subtle differences between each color. I'm using US khaki on his belt, and we don't want all the gear to be the same color. So to create some variation, we've enlisted our German beige. And you know, when all this is said and done, I don't think anyone's going to notice our imposter color. Our figure has a nice DIY fabric sling for his big ol' 30 cal, so we're going to use a little green-gray for that. Sticking with our neutral tones, but adding a little color to break up all these beiges. I love this red leather color for US holsters. This figure has a 45 sidearm, so we're going to paint up the holster in this nice ruddy red. It's a bit hard to see because it's so small, but I've also painted the grip of his 45 with some flat black and a little German dark brown. While we're in nice and close here, we're also going to paint up his canteen with some of that same green-gray we used on the 30 cal sling. Our guy's starting to come together here, looking pretty solid. We've got a few more details to paint in, including his GI scarf. These were usually a nice brown wool, so we're using this Vallejo beige-brown color to get the job done. The main event here, so to speak, is our big old 30 cal, which we're going to paint in with some Ammo MIG flat black for figures. Just be careful not to spill over onto any of the clothing we've already painted up. There is some really fine detail work here, so just go slow. For the ammo belt that's hanging out of the weapon, we're going to start out with some Tamiya gold leaf. You can tell I haven't used this stuff in a while, but looks like it's still in good shape. We're going to paint in our ammo here, being sure to get into all the crevices between each individual round, but also being careful not to get any of the metallic paint onto our 30 cal itself. Once the rounds themselves are complete, we're going to use some light flesh color to paint in the actual connector belt. Here's what I ended up with. We'll use a little dark wash after all the painting is complete to really accentuate the individual rounds. At this stage, our figure is pretty much completely painted, but I wanted to add some highlights to his equipment and to some of these smaller elements we just finished painting. I started off by creating a 1-to-1 mix of green-gray to German camo beige, and we're going to use this color to highlight the raised portions of his canteen and of his hands. This is going to help add a little depth to these parts, and it helps break up the single color block that we used for these sections. Just go slow here and try and follow the natural lines in the sculpt. It might look a little blocky, but honestly that's okay at this scale. You have to consider that most folks will be looking at this figure from a few feet away, so we're helping to accentuate all the details and create some visual interest for our viewer. Scale modeling is an art after all, so playing with artificial light and shadow here really just helps bring our small scale subject to life. I've repeated this highlighting process on his packs, pants, straps, holster, boots, and scarf by just mixing a little light beige or light flesh to the respective base colors. Play around with your ratios here until you find something that looks good to you. Here's our figure with all those highlights completed. We'll set him aside for now and shift gears to paint up his head. We're going to start by diluting a little medium flesh tone with thinner so we can airbrush it on and give us a nice base for our face. Here's our guy's head. You can see just how much detail goes into these Alpine sculpts. It helps even a hack like me end up with a decent finished product. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. We're going to start by brushing a bit of dark flesh onto his neck and the areas of his forehead that would be in shadow from the brim of his helmet. We're also going to block in a bit of this color around his mouth and in the eye sockets. This is all going to look a little weird as we go along here, but I've found that faces are all about building up areas of color to create depth and warmth to our figure. Next, we're going to use the medium flesh tone that we originally airbrushed on and block in his cheeks and the area around his nose. Try to feather this into the areas of dark flesh that you just painted, and keep your paint relatively thin as you go along. The name of the game here is about building up several thin layers to achieve the look that we want. At this stage, we're going to want to paint in his eyes. Now, some folks don't paint in the whites of the eyes at this scale, but I like to add them because I think the eyes are what really makes these figures come to life. It's kind of freaky. We're using our light flesh tone again for the eyeballs here. Don't worry about overpainting because we're going to come back and shape up the eyes in just a second. For the eye color, you can use whatever darker tone you like here. I'm using one of the greens that I mixed earlier, and we want to make 2 vertical lines in our eyeballs. Be conscious of what way your figure is looking here. We don't want to end up with a cross-eyed machine gunner. Probably not in the best interest of anybody. To finish up the eyes, we're going to use our dark flesh tone again and create a nice almond shape for each eye. Make them a little smaller than you might initially expect. We want to avoid having big old googly eyes here, which can easily happen. I try to visualize them almost squinting. This helps me find the right balance at this scale. With our eyes complete, we're going to grab some olive drab and paint up the inner rim of our helmet. Be careful not to overpaint onto the skin here. Moving back to our skin tone, we're going to use some flat flesh and pull out some highlights on the raised portions of his face. First, we'll block in some simple inverted triangles on the cheekbones to help emphasize his facial structure. We're also going to add a small highlight on his chin, and we're going to help accentuate the musculature of his neck by following along the sculpt there. As we did before, use thin layers of paint here and try and feather it into the surrounding colors. You can see that as we start to build up tones here, that the skin looks a little more alive and a little less clammy, so to speak. To help with that, we're going to use a very thin layer of sunny skin tone on his cheeks and on his nose to help add a little warmth and pull all of our color blocks together. Now we're going to give our guy some eyebrows. You can use whatever brown tone you want here. I'm using our beige brown. We just want to cut in some brows right above the eyes. You can cheat these down a little closer to the whites of the eyes to help accentuate our eye shape and create a little contrast here. I like to give my mouths a little extra warmth by adding just a touch of brown rose. Go super light here, it's easy to overdo this. To finish up our head, we're going to move back up to his helmet and paint the whole thing in olive drab. Since we went with the head with the helmet netting, I'm going to use some green gray and dry brush the helmet to help accentuate the sculpt there. Finally, I'm going to take some red leather and carefully paint in the helmet straps. I think it would be a little more accurate to paint these khaki, but I like the red as a great contrast up there on the olive drab, and I'm going to go with it. I also forgot that I wanted to do some dry brushing with white aluminum to help accentuate the details of the 30 cal, so I just did that here real quick. And that is going to wrap up the painting process for this guy. So to protect the parts for some light weathering, I'm going to spray the whole figure and the head with some AK Gauzy agent for a nice gloss coat. Here is our very shiny torso. This is going to help the ammo dark wash that we're about to use here flow into all the fine sculpt details on this figure. We're going to load up our brush with some wash and let it run into the seams along his jacket, as well as the details on his buttons, on the MG, on all his packs and bags, etc. It's okay if it looks a little messy because we're going to come back and clean it all up with some enamel thinner in just a second. Here is our torso all mucked up, so let's break out the thinner and make the magic happen. Using some ammo odorless enamel thinner, we're going to come in with our brush and remove some of the excess wash from the raised areas of the sculpt where we don't want it to be. The thinner is going to help the wash flow into just the deepest crevices, like all the fine details on this sculpt, and we can use it to help wipe off any excess. This takes a little practice, so just go slow and experiment with it a bit. If you take off more wash than you wanted, you can always go back and add some more and try again. We're going to do this exact same process on his head. The wash does a really good job of sinking into all the holes on the helmet netting, and that ends up looking great. I also like to put a very small amount of wash on his mouth, nostrils, and ears to help pull out the really nice details there. We're going to remove almost all of that wash on the face with our thinner, leaving behind just enough to pop those details. With our wash process complete, we're going to let all that enamel dry completely and then move on to a matte coat to protect all of our work. I like to use a couple light coats of Ammo Lucky Matte Varnish. And here's our figure all finished up. We just need to attach his head, trim a little excess resin, and we'll be good to go. Make sure you're wearing gloves. We don't want the oils on our skin to damage the varnish. And you can gently snap the head off the mounting screw. Then we're going to very carefully cut the head off the resin block, trim off any excess, and super glue it to the torso. Looking good, sir. Very nice to meet you in one piece. The last thing we need to do is trim the resin mounting blocks on his feet, which we can do with our spruce nippers and a little careful work with the hobby knife. And just like that, our 30 cal gunner is ready to join his company. So here are both figures from the brand new Alpine Miniatures US MG team in winter gear. I learned a lot painting these guys and I had a blast along the way. My big takeaway here was that painting shadows and highlights rather than just relying on washes can be really effective. I think this was a pretty solid first attempt at this technique, and I look forward to experimenting with it on some other figures down the road. I'm still not great with face painting, and I know I've got a lot of work to do there, but the name of the game is just improving a little bit each time, right? I hope you enjoyed the video and got something out of my attempts here. Hopefully you can use some of them on your next figure paint. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'll leave links in the description below for all the products I used today, as well as a link to the Alpine Miniatures website if you want to snag these guys for your own collection. If you'd like, you can subscribe to the channel for more scale modeling content. I try and post something new just about once a week. You can also follow me on Instagram at Sprues and Brews for more work in progress content and all sorts of other fun stuff. So that's it for me today. Until next time, guys, be well, happy building, cheers.